So this is our class review of Unit 8, Ecology. So starting with plant behavior, remember any tropism is a movement in response to a stimuli. So plants are going to show phototropism, photoperiodism, and gravitropism defenses. So the photo obviously meaning light. So plants will bend towards the light. That stimulus of the light, you've all probably seen this, when you were younger. You put a plant in a closet or something, they're going to bend towards the light. Photoperiodism is the idea that plants are only going to bloom at certain times of the year based on the length of the night, certain times of day. And gravitropism is going to help plants actually grow towards the top, like the north. So if you put a plant on its side like this, it won't grow out, it'll grow up. Also, this helps plants. We have gravitropism defenses that make them start producing unpalatable chemicals if they're not growing in the right way. So there's two types of learned behavior. Remember, learned behavior is anything you learn by watching, usually with your social group. Innate is you're born with it. It's instinctive. It's like your reflexes. You have it starting from birth. Usually these types of behaviors are going to be things that help you survive. So this could be things like kinesis, which is where you change your rate of movement. So if a bug's going to run quicker when it starts to rain or if it gets too hot. Taxis is the direction of movement, so fish a lot of times will swim towards a current. A fixed action pattern is a sequence of behaviors that an animal will do from start to finish no matter what. So if you remember, we did the duck rolling the egg back into its nest. And then also migration and imprinting, so animals that migrate from north to south, let's say, do that as an instinctual movement. And imprinting is the idea that a baby animal will become attached to its first caregiver, and that caregiver, no matter who it is who they attach to, so it could not necessarily even be an animal of the same species. The two types of learned behavior we talked about are operant conditioning and classical. Operant conditioning is kind of the reward punishment behavior thing. So if you do something and you get a reward, you're more likely to repeat that behavior, and then vice versa with punishment. And then classical conditioning is where you have the behavior that's not even associated with the stimulus. This is Pavlov's dogs. So they would actually start to salivate as a sound of a bell, not even in the presence of food. And here's a couple examples of all these types of movements. So here we have kinesis. So this bug's actually going to go a little bit quicker in order to get under some shade and a moist leaf. It's going to run quicker. This is showing taxis, which this fish is actually going to be facing the current. That's where the food's going to come from. This is that fixed action pattern of the duck where it's going to roll the egg back into its nest. It will roll anything, so a soda can or another type of egg. And remember, even if the egg kind of rolls out from under its neck, it'll do the whole roll back into the nest before it restarts. So again, classical conditioning here is showing you Pavlov. The whistle or the bell causes the dog to salivate because you're going to feed it every time you do a bell. And then operant is that reward punishment. So you see that the rat is going to push the lever and get food. That's a reward. So it's going to learn to do that behavior and continue that behavior. This is showing you migration of birds. And then here's the imprinting. This is ducklings that have imprinted on an actual duck. And then here's ducklings. They might be geese that imprinted on a human. And again, it's that first initial caregiver. And it makes sense because that's who's going to protect it, feed it, do all the things that it needs to survive. So social behavior is what you learn as a part of your social or family group. There are interactions between individuals that develop usually out of evolutionary change and survival. So altruistic behavior, that's kind of the self-sacrificing behavior. That's where the prairie dog or the squirrel will scream to alert for predators. Even though that's bad for that individual, it's actually good for the family. It's going to help keep the family alive and pass on the family's genes. Cooperation would be like pack hunting. Again, you're hunting for everybody to keep everybody alive. Everyone will get some. Dominance hierarchy is going to be the pecking order, the dominant male, keeping kind of everything in order. Agnostic behavior is any kind of territoriality or fighting. This is where males are going to fight over mates or territory. So lions do this, gorillas do this, deer. A lot of male species do this. And then communication, which can be verbal or nonverbal. All different ways that animals communicate within their social group. So thermoregulation is the ability to control your body temperature. We usually classify animals as an endotherm or ectotherm. You probably know it as warm-blooded or cold-blooded, which is a little bit of a misnomer. So an endo, meaning in, is an animal that can control its own body temperature. You are an endotherm. So if you get cold, you can shiver to warm up. If you get hot, you can sweat to cool down. So you're able to maintain a stable internal pressure, internal temperature without any outside, impact. So this is a bobcat. You see his temperature is pretty stable. An ectotherm, or what you heard of cold-blooded. The reason why we don't really say cold-blooded anymore is that kind of led kids to think that they were colder. Their body temperature was lower, which is actually not true. Their body temperatures usually can be as high as ours. The difference is an ectotherm relies on the outside environment to control its body temperature. So these animals cannot shiver to get warm or sweat to get cool. So there's a lot of reptiles. So for example, here's a snake. So this is where you see a lot of reptiles living in warmer climates. And they actually sun themselves on rocks and things during the day to help warm their bodies up. That's because they cannot maintain their own internal body temperature. So remember, a population can be controlled by density dependent or independent factors. Density dependent depends on the population size. This is usually things that lead to competition for resources, things like that. So this is food, competition, parasites, disease, amount of waste, predation, relationships. And then density independent factors are things that have where the population size has no effect. A lot of times this is things like weather, climate, natural disasters, things that kind of happen to a species no matter how big or small that population size is. So again, you have two types of growth in a population. You have logistic growth that goes up and up and up, or we kind of say it's a J curve, or a logistic growth, which is an S curve, where it increases until it hits something called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the maximum population that can be supported by an individual habitat. We use the letter K to show that. A lot of times what happens is this population will grow exponentially, and usually it overshoots the carrying capacity. And then some individuals die, and then it kind of levels off. They don't die and go all the way down. It usually overshoots and then levels off. And then exponential just keeps increasing and increasing. Remember, some scientists think exponential growth really doesn't exist, that exponential growth is just this part of a logistic growth. It hasn't hit the carrying capacity yet. So we talked about life table and survivorship curves. A life table is going to show you right here. It's going to be, the death rate, the birth rate, the age that most animals die. It's going to tell you a lot about where the population is going. Is it increasing, decreasing, staying the same? It can tell you average lifespan of individuals. So if we see here, after about age 2, whatever this animal is, the rate starts to really drop off really quickly. Survivorship curve is going to show you how an organism is going to live and survive. So type 1 is where most are going to survive infancy, and there's a higher death rate later in life. That would be humans. Type 3 is where many infants die, but then you get adulthood, a lot of surviving for a long time. And then you have the weird type, which is type 2, where you have basically constant mortality rate going at any given moment. With those populations, they can be spaced in different ways. The 3 types are going to be random, clumped, or uniform. Clumped is the most common. Humans are clumped. Usually when the pattern is clumped, it's clumped around a resource. So remember, most humans would live within 50 miles of water. Random is plants and trees. Usually that's where the seeds just kind of grow where they land. And then uniform, where everything's kind of evenly spaced, is less common. Penguins do this. It's more about kind of the territory and the nesting area, but that's not as likely. The R selection and K selection curves are actually going to look similar to the life history curves. Remember, R selection is where you basically give birth to a lot of babies. You don't take care of them, and you expect only a few babies to survive. So you see in the R selection graph, a lot of babies are born, but most of them die. Most of them do not survive to adulthood. That's going to lead to really rapid evolutionary change, because the only babies that survive are the ones that are best suited to the environment. K selection is more slow. You're going to give birth to a few babies, and all the babies for the most part are going to survive. So you have a lot of babies surviving infanthood to adulthood, and you get the drop off later in life. You have high parental care. So when those babies are born, the parents stay with the babies for a long time to make sure they survive. So remember, genetic diversity is key for population survival. You want there to be a lot of diversity among the species, among the animals in the ecosystem. The more variety you have, the better chance for long-term survival. So this extinction vortex, remember, happens when a population gets so small that their genetic diversity gets so low, you get interbreeding, which leads to even less genetic diversity, which results in a reduction of fitness, right? They're not going to be able to survive as well. So you have lower reproduction rates and higher mortality, which leads to an even smaller population, and it just goes down from there. This can very easily and very quickly lead to extinction of an organism. So within populations, there's a lot of communication happening. There's cooperation behavior with the predator warnings, or pack hunting where those animals are communicating while they're doing that. So this is where they're working together to achieve a goal. There's a lot of behaviors that are meaning to enhance reproductive success. This is territory marking when animals will pee on a tree. That's communicating, hey, I'm here. It could also be communicating, I'm in heat, I'm ready to reproduce. There's different reasons for different behaviors. It kind of all just depends on what the animal's trying to do. Animals use a wide variety of communication, including visual, audible, tactical, electrical, chemical, all to kind of do all these things they need to survive to indicate dominance, find food, establish territory, or reproduce. So the niche is the role in the community that the organism plays. The idea is that you would have one organism per niche, so like one organism does that job. What we see now, we talk about the realized niche, is that, that doesn't really happen. There are a lot of times where we have sharing of resources. So, you see the thalamus all the way up this coastline where really it probably shares the resource with another animal. So two animals kind of share the niche. But the niche is the role or job that an animal plays within the community. Food chains and food webs are going to show you kind of how energy is passed on, what animals eat each other. They're generally kind of marked with first the producer, which is going to be the plant that's going to make its own food through photosynthesis. And then you have the consumers all above that. The primary consumer is going to eat the grass or the plant. The secondary eats the primary. The tertiary eats the secondary, and so on. A lot of times you don't really go above a tertiary or quaternary consumer because remember that 10% rule says the energy that's getting passed on each time is less and less and less. So it really wouldn't make logical sense to eat a tertiary or quaternary consumer because they don't have a lot of energy they're giving you. There's also decomposers involved, mushrooms, bacteria, etc., that help recycle dead organisms and replace nutrients. And then usually you're going to see something called an apex predator. In this case, it would be the hawk. That's going to be the top of the food chain where nobody eats it. So if you are not getting eaten by anybody in the food chain, you are considered an apex predator. And again, to go along with that, we just talked about the 10% rule. So this is saying that at each level, only 10% of the energy gets passed on. Not 10% lose, 10% remaining. So you see, you start with 20,000 kilocalories, and the next one you're down to 2,000. Then 200, then 20, then 2. So again, this is kind of what keeps these food webs from getting to like 10 or 11 consumers. Because if you look up at this hawk, he's only going to give you 2 kilocalories, and he's going to be hard to catch. So it's just really not worth eating him. You're not going to get enough energy from him. This also kind of governs how these animals eat. The ones that are eating animals that have less value, you're going to have to eat more of it. What happens is most of that energy is lost as heat in each ecosystem, each kind of level of the ecosystem. So productivity is basically how much energy an ecosystem produces. You can have gross primary productivity, which is the total amount of carbon produced, basically how much carbon is produced by photosynthesis by all the plants in an ecosystem. Net primary productivity is the amount left over after the animals respirate the carbon. So to get NPP, net primary productivity, you take the GPP minus the respiration rate. And that's going to give you how much carbon is left to be passed on to other levels. Within these ecosystems, you're going to have a lot of interactions between species. Interactions can be mutual or positive. So example there would be the sea anemone and the clownfish. You can have a positive negative where one animal is benefited, one is harmed. So this is any predation event, parasitism you see here, the tick on the dog, a shark eating a fish. It's always good for one, bad for the other. Then you can also have something called commensalism where it benefits one organism and doesn't really affect the other one. So the one that is not really affected kind of just lets it happen. So this slide's just a summary of some of the defenses that we looked at. Animal predation defenses to try not to be eaten, basically. The big two are Batesian mimicry and Muralian mimicry. So remember, one of them is the animal really is poisonous. The other one is they're pretending to be poisonous. Either way, they're trying to tell somebody, don't eat me. This is that aposematic warning where the coloration, that bright red frog's trying to tell predators, hey, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. So a keystone species is going to be a species that's not necessarily the top predator or top animal, but it's going to be vital to the ecosystem. If that keystone species goes away, the whole ecosystem can fall apart. So an example here would be the sea otter in the Pacific, kind of near California. If the sea otters go away, the kelp actually goes away, which is going to lead to kind of further effects of there's no kelp, there's going to be sea urchins overrunning the area. So the sea otter is that keystone species for that area. Not necessarily top predator, just the most important species in that ecosystem. Again, the reason why we want to know that is so that we can protect that otter, because we know that otter is really important to the whole ecosystem. Invasive species are any plant or animal that gets introduced to a new environment where it typically did not live before. The problem with invasive species is they typically have no predators or nothing holding them back, so they grow or replicate extremely quickly, and they outcompete native species for resources. So these are all plants, invasive plants. Crayfish is another example. Like I said, the stink bugs were invasive here for a while. Now the lanternflies are going to be the invasive ones. So again, the very key to invasive species is they have no predators. They have nothing keeping their populations down. So their populations will spike and kind of overtake other animals. So it's important to know kind of the categories and definitions of things. So remember, we start with an individual or organism. That's a single individual. A group of the same species or organism is called a population. A community is all the different species living in an area. An ecosystem is all the living and non-living things that happen in an area. So it's going to include weather. A biome is the entire ecosystem over a large area. And then biosphere would be the whole planet. Within those, we can describe biotic and abiotic factors. Bio meaning living, so that's anything living in that ecosystem. So kind of the plants, the flora, the fauna, the fungi. Abiotic, A meaning not, is non-living. So this would be the weather, the soil, the light, the air, different ways to describe the ecosystem. So kind of the way things eat and food change is all about energy exchange. So we see again this pyramid where you're getting, 10% moving on to the third level. So the reason why, these animals are eating the next level is to get energy. But only 10% of that energy gets passed on each time, which again kind of governs how things eat. So plant eaters, because they're getting more a percentage of energy, that first level consumer generally doesn't have to eat as much as, for example, a third level consumer. Where that energy is being lost is heat. Two kind of scientific laws go along with this. The first one is the first law of thermodynamics, which is saying energy is neither created or destroyed, it only changes form. So what goes in must come out. There has to be some kind of exchange. So again, if you're losing that energy, it has to go somewhere. In this case, it leaves as heat. And the second law of thermodynamics says that some energy is lost during heat during any conversion process. This leads to the 10% rule. That's kind of where that comes from. So this is just two ways of looking at the 10% rule, looking at how the energy is passed through an ecosystem. Here it's showing you the number of kilocalories each time. Here it's actually showing you kind of in a bar graph that as you go up the food chain, you get way less energy by eating that organism. So you can see eating plants is going to give you the most energy, primary consumers, and you go up, you get less and less and less. And again, this governs how animals eat. This is why cows can eat only grass, because grass has a lot of energy to it. Whereas some of these tertiary consumers here usually have to eat a lot of secondary consumer meat to get enough energy to live because of the percentage of carbon, the percentage of energy that you're getting from that. So you guys did look at the nutrient cycles. You're going to remember that nutrients cycle, meaning they rotate through an ecosystem. So just kind of to summarize those cycles, carbon cycle has to do with photosynthesis and respiration. It has to do with passing that on through eating and absorbing, and then theoretically organic organisms would break down and put carbon back into the soil. Fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels are introducing way more carbon than we're used to, which is throwing that carbon cycle out of whack. The nitrogen cycle has to do with nitrogen fixation and nitrification involving bacteria. Some of that nitrogen goes into the air, and then it kind of goes back into the soil, but nitrogen, is a necessary chemical for life. The unique thing about the phosphorus cycle is there is no gaseous form. Phosphorus is going to be in rocks and soil. And then, the water cycle, where you have liquid water is going to evaporate, condense, make clouds, precipitate. They're going to have the runoff that goes back into the water that gets sucked back up. Don't forget about those chnops elements. This is kind of where they come into play with the nutrients. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus can lead to eutrophication and algal blooms. Algal blooms, again, are going to lead to hypoxia in areas where the algae is going to suck up all the oxygen, which is not good. The algal blooms come up from that runoff, that eutrophic runoff. So we're really trying to get factories and farms and other things to not dump their wastewater into oceans, because that's what causes the algal blooms. So here's just pictures of the different cycles. I wouldn't spend a ton of time memorizing these. It's more of a concept-based thing, understanding that all these nutrients are going to cycle through. So each part of the cycle is important and it needs to be maintained in order to keep all these necessary elements moving through an ecosystem. So if we have, for example, a damaged area or an area that's been, used for a mine or something, if you leave it alone, it will kind of do ecological succession and fix itself. The two different ones are called primary succession and secondary succession. The difference would be just kind of the starting point. So if you have primary succession, you're starting from basically just rock, no soil at all. Whereas secondary succession, you're starting with soil, usually after disturbance. For example, if a bunch of trees are cleared, that would be a secondary succession. Then what happens is you get moss, you get small shrubs, small trees, and then large trees. But if you do leave an area alone, it will come back. The succession will happen and you will get a nice forest in several years if you let it go. The way to do this, kind of to save an area, is to plant species that will help the soil, kind of re-enrich the soil, put those chinops elements back in the soil, and that'll help the producers grow more quickly. So this is just showing you primary and secondary succession in pictures. So again, primary has no soil, you're starting from rock, and then you go from, that to the trees, and then for the secondary, you're starting with soil, so you're going to get to the larger trees more quickly. And again, nature will do this on its own. If we just leave it alone, it'll kind of, reinvigorate itself and fix itself. So just a kind of a summary of human impact. Climate change, we talked a lot about the CO2 and the burning of fossil fuels. The greenhouse effect is that causing our Earth temperatures to rise quicker than normal, possibly. The big thing there is are we going to have time to adapt and evolve with that changing climate? Ozone depletions, the ozone's meant to block out harmful UV rays. We're releasing stuff into our atmosphere that's kind of poking holes in our ozone. If we just stop doing it, the ozone will close itself. Deforestation's a big one because that's a big biodiversity one because of the habitat loss. We're losing a lot of organisms because of that deforestation and to plant trees or build farms. Overharvesting or overfishing, you're going to mess up the biodiversity. You're going to mess up the food chain. You could mess up a keystone species. So we're really trying to regulate that. And then pollution is going to, we talked about the eutrophication. Also the biomagnification. A pollutant gets magnified. The higher it goes up a food chain, gets more concentrated. So again, the biomes you did look at, you should have a chart. I'm just going to go over them briefly. They are not going to ask you specifics about the biomes. It's more going to be, do you have a general idea of what it looks like? So for example, when you think tropical rainforest, they're never going to say how much rain do you get. What you want to think of with tropical rainforest is they're near the equator. They usually have high temp, high humidity, high precipitation. You're going to get a lot of carbon here because you're going to have a lot of plants and trees, a lot of biodiversity here. These are usually the hot spots where you have a lot of animals. A desert's going to be the exact opposite. It's going to be dry. You're going to have more sand than you are going to have plants. It usually gets very cold at night and very hot during the day. There are plants that live here, but they're well adapted to living there. They're not the same kind of plants that you're going to see in the rainforest. They have deep roots, thick waxy cuticles, needles, so they're going to be a different kind of plant. There are animals that live here as well. They, again, are adapted to living here. They either come out at night, they have large ears or things to do heat exchange, or they're burrowing to keep cool. Grasslands are going to be huge areas in temperate or tropical regions. You're going to have low rainfall or seasonal rainfall. So you're either going to have almost no rainfall, or you're going to have kind of these periods of time where there's little rain, and then you have a lot of rain at once. You're going to have grasses more than leafy plants, which again are adapted to living in that area, but it kind of takes a certain animal to eat those. So you're going to have bison, prairie dogs, things like that know how to eat that type of grass. I would say you have pretty high biodiversity in that area. The temperate deciduous forest is where we live. So you're going to have seasons in a deciduous forest where the trees are going to be different depending on the season. The temperature and the precipitation is going to be different in the season. So a lot of times you have animals that are really good at adapting to that changing season. The coniferous forest is going to be like Northern California-ish, a lot of pine trees. You're going to, again, get some seasons, but usually it's going to be colder in the winter, more snowfall in the winter. You're dominated by conifer trees, which are the pine trees essentially, which are different than the leafy trees. They survive differently and different things eat them. You do have a good amount of plants and animals that live there. Again, very well adapted to that environment. The tundra you can think of as a cold desert. So it's basically a desert with snow, usually in the very northern part of the world. Has a lot of permafrost, which means it doesn't have a lot of animals. I'm sorry, it doesn't have a lot of plants. Very little vegetation, very little animal life there. There are some, and again, they're very well adapted to living in that area. Aquatic biomes in general, remember, are the ones that live in the water. So 75% of the earth is water. You can have salt water or a fresh water. Estuaries and wetlands are where they kind of have that mix of salt and fresh. Usually those have more animals in them. Don't forget, one of the key features of an ocean is going to be that photic zone. Photic meaning where the light can penetrate. If you are down here in the aphotic zone, there is no life, there is no photosynthesis. We used to think there was no life. Now we kind of know there's life that survives on these hydrothermal vents. And then just remember that the reason the ocean looks blue or green is because that's the light that penetrates the furthest under the water. And then finally, this map is just showing you kind of where these biomes are. Again, they're not going to ask you a specific question about them. Just have a general idea that, the tropicals near the equator, the tundras up the north, those kind of things.